All right, so today we're looking at chapter 5 of the BCS manual, and we are looking at behavior therapy as a technique. So this is another one of our methods for helping our clients create positive change, right? Obviously, we have talked about goal setting so far. Well, maybe goal setting isn't the only way to really affect positive change, right? And so this is where behavior therapy comes in. Behavior therapy is kind of your classic, it's kind of the classic psychology, right? In fact, it's kind of more commonly known as classical conditioning, if you've ever heard that term before. So I'm going to go ahead and skip the intro video today. And we're going to go ahead and I'm going to give you a little intro on behavior therapy. So behavior therapy is really, really cool because it's basically looking at how our brains respond to certain stimuli and through like different behaviors. And then those different behaviors are going to have certain types of consequences, right? So when we talk about like, if you've ever heard of like Pavlov's dog, right? So Pavlov was an a-hole to dogs, but like he's more famously known for the fact that he would do these experiments where he would basically hook a dog up and he would ring a dinner bell, right? And he would measure how much that dog would start salivating, because what would happen is when he would ring that dinner bell, he would then feed the dog. So he would feed the dog and ring a dinner bell, and then he would, do that over and over and over again. And then that would sort of reinforce this idea until eventually he got to a place where he could just ring a bell and the dog would start salivating, even if he didn't present him with any actual food. So that's sort of how this original experiment really worked, right? And the idea there was that he believed that our brains draw certain connections behind like certain types of like stimuli, right? I mean, if I were to, if I were to play, even just like if you're like a regular like sports watcher, like a regular like NFL watcher, and I were to play like the music, like the NFL, music that you would hear before like a game, you would probably start getting a little excited, right? Like that would probably lead to, because your brain draws an association between like this fun activity and something else, right? If you've ever like smelled something and then all of a sudden you start to get like hungry, or like you start to have like certain emotional feelings around that, right? That's an example of like behavior therapy, and where there's what is called an antecedent, which is like, oh, you can think of it as like a trigger, sort of causes your brain to go through a routine that it's used to going through associated with that trigger. And then whenever it goes through that routine, there's going to be some type of consequence, because there's always consequences to our actions, right? Now, when I say consequence, a lot of times we kind of conjure up like negative imagery around consequences. We're like, oh, there's a consequence. But that consequence could be, something totally positive, so like anytime, your behaviors are going to have some type of effect on the world, right? So that's where we kind of look at this in the idea of behavior therapy, right? And so it is the application of principles that are derived from scientific research that's theorizing about learning to problems in living, right? So the idea here is that we are looking at the idea that we as humans, we have a lot of learned habits. We have a lot of learned things that we do that are associated with our antecedents. They're associated with our triggers, right? I've worked with clients before, and it's so funny. Like I had a client who had a real problem with like fast food. He was just like, I'm on my diet, and he's like, I don't feel like I'm hungry, and I don't, I feel like the diet's working and stuff. And he's like, I'm eating all the healthy stuff I'm supposed to be eating, but like I still just find myself. He's like, he described it. He was like, it's like traveling, it's like teleporting. He's like, I'll be driving along, and then all of a sudden I'm in, I think it was a Carl's Jr. drive-through. And it was like consistent. It was just like all the time. And he's like, and I don't know what it is. He's like, I don't get it. And, we started thinking about like, well, let's look at like how your brain's working, right? Like, is it ever like on the way to work? And he's like, no, it's always on the way home from work. And it's like, okay, so clearly like your brain has drawn like an association between like either the hunger that you're feeling on the way home from work, because, it's the end of the day and you're probably going home for dinner with your family. or your brain has drawn like an association between like this action of driving home from work. Either way, like you've got this action that's leading to sort of a routine. You've got this constant routine that you kind of keep engaging in, which is pulling you off of your goals, right? So like all we have to do is interrupt your routine a little bit, and hopefully we'll get like a different consequence, because the consequence now is that you're getting a lot of like, saturated fats and cholesterols and calories and all these things that are derailing you from your diet and keeping you from reaching your health goals. So like the literal fix, we tried a bunch of different things. The literal fix was just like, hey, I know it's weird, but like you're gonna take the less efficient route home every day. So he started driving like just a slightly different path, even though it added maybe 1 or 2 or 3 minutes to his commute. But that was enough to like interrupt things to give him like conscious control back. And so his brain stopped going on autopilot and he stopped like stopping at fast food. And it was a huge difference. And it was like overnight. It broke the habit like that. Normally, breaking habits still going to take a substantial amount of willpower and effort. But like that's a really good example of how if you interrupt a routine, it can result in different consequences. The consequences in this case is, stop falling off the wagon on a diet, right? Now, this is a very early behavior therapy was very early in the realm of psychology as like a field, right? And so also very early in the in the psychology as the field, sort of the original version of psychology as it existed in the field was what we call psychoanalysis or Freudian therapy, right? And so this is where Sigmund Freud, basically invented this profession, like therapy. And for the record, like I'm just gonna go on record here and say that like Freud was pretty much wrong about everything. I am not a Freud fan personally, so that is a very personal opinion. So if I don't have very favorable views here, I'm definitely no expert on psychology. I am just not exactly a huge fan of his. But it focused on the idea of like early childhood development. Freud believed that like we have a lot of like instinctive thoughts, things that are just kind of pre-programmed into our brain as like a biologic animal. And so like your thoughts and your actions were very much related to your childhood, and that would shape everything about who you are as like a person, which is where we get that sort of classic, you see it in movies all the time where somebody will go to a therapist and they lay down in the chair, and the therapist, the go-to shtick in these movies or cartoons or whatever is like, tell me about your mother. It's always like a German, because Sigmund Freud was German. I think he was Polish. Hold on, Sigmund. Where is he from? I mean, Freud is totally a German name. Austrian. Okay. So that's like the classic like version of like therapy that we kind of think of when we think of like what therapy is. And it involves like going back into your brain and just recreating these experiences that you had from childhood, right? And the thing is, like, that takes, number one, you can see like it's highly criticized for like the fact that it costs a ton of money because you're paying your therapist hourly, and it takes hours and hours and hours of you just going back in time. And it's like, was this the memory that shaped who you are as a person? Nope. All right, let's spend a couple hours going to a different memory, So definitely not a huge fan of your classic Freudian therapy, personally. And actually, before I move on, I want to tell you guys about something that's kind of fun. The secret history of thoughts. So for anybody who needs them, anybody who's watching this video version right now, or Andres or Dalen, if you guys are interested, I actually haven't done one in a while, but I try to come up with like a fun extra credit assignment every now and then, to give you guys attendance back. I can't necessarily, like, extra credit does not exist on our level, like it's not a real like thing that I can just apply and be like, you get more points on your test or whatever. We can't do that. That's totally not cool. But what I can do is we can give you a couple hours back if you have been absent. So if you've missed any class and you want to make some hours up, I like to give out a couple extra credit assignments every now and then. And this is kind of a fun one that I like to do. So if you want to know a little bit about like the realm of like behavior therapy in particular, but generally just about psychology, here's a really interesting podcast by what's called this podcast is called Invisibilia. And this is from years ago, but they did this 2-episode special called The Secret History of Thoughts. And there's 2 episodes here. You can see this one's 33 minutes, this one's 22 minutes. So it'll be about an hour of your time commitment. And basically, this podcast, the first one is called Dark Thoughts, and the second one is called The Locked In Man. And the idea here, the reason they call it The Secret History of Thoughts is because these are 2 very, very interesting stories, which are really fun to listen to. But what the episodes are actually about is about in 2015 and still even now today, there's kind of a revolution that's happening in the realm of like psychology and in the realm of like how we study therapy and how we study psychology. And, it used to be like Freudian analysis, right? It used to be like Sigmund Freud was the guy. And so everybody used his techniques. And it was like all of your thoughts, all of your actions, all your feelings are related to how you were shaped as like a child, right? And that was like the belief for like a really long time. And then we started like, getting smarter and moving away from Freud's stuff into this idea that your thoughts actually shape more about like who you are. And so if you can restructure your thoughts to be more effective, you have a little bit more control over your personality and you have more control over your emotions and your life and things like this. And now we're starting to find I'm sorry, and it was your thoughts and your actions. Sorry, it was your thoughts and your actions. And now we're finding that like currently in the world of psychology, a lot the new sort of wave of thinking is that your thoughts really don't actually have that much impact on like who you are. And so like they're just these things that kind of come into your brain for a second, make you think something interesting and then leave. Like and so these 2 episodes both kind of highlight that through these really interesting stories, and they're really, really fascinating. The Dark Thoughts one is all about this guy who I think was from Santa Monica, if I'm not mistaken. Surfer guy, real friendly, kind of loved by everyone in his life. And then he and his wife were watching this movie one day. I don't know if you guys ever watched. It's called City of God. It's a kind of action style movie.
Is that the Brazilian movie?
Yeah, set in Brazil. Yeah.
Okay.
A pretty violent movie though, right?
I never saw it actually.
Oh, okay. So it's a pretty violent movie. And this guy watches this. This is so funny. Charlie's coming. What's up, Charlie?
So, bro.
We're in the middle of a weird story. We're talking about an interesting podcast that I'm sending out for extra credit.
How much have the class have I missed?
Just a few minutes. We're just talking about we're setting up what we're talking about today. So we're still talking about we're going to be doing behavior therapy today. We're talking about how the world of psychology has changed a lot in terms of what we used to study versus what we believe now.
Got it. Cool.
This Dark Thoughts podcast is all about this guy who watched this movie and he felt kind of ill. He was like, I don't know if I can finish this. And he kind of like, he left and he like laid down and it like kind of bothered him and it sat with him for a few days and it was like really affecting him in very negative ways. And he started having really violent imagery where he was like imagining himself like hitting someone or kicking someone. And then like it started to get a little bit more intense. He started seeing himself like stabbing someone with a knife, like, and it started getting like really, really, really intense. And it wasn't just like the thoughts that, I know this is going to sound very weird. But I'm not talking about like the general thoughts that like you and I might have where we're like, oh, I could kill that person right now. Like we're very frustrated with someone and you're like, I could just walk over there and just slap that person in the face. I'm so upset right now. Not that kind of thing. I mean like in detail, because generally when you have that kind of thought, it's very hyperbolic. It's very much like an exaggeration. It's like, oh my, kill you. You don't picture yourself doing any of that. You just say it and kind of move on with your life, right? But this guy, he started having these very, very, very detailed images of him going up to someone and like grabbing them by, like, he was, imagine them in such that he'd be like, I would grab their left arm and their collar and do these really violent acts to this person. So he started really getting freaked out, and he was afraid that he was going to hurt someone. So he started seeing a therapist, and his therapist, who was very much of the style of like, your thoughts implement you in your actions, like who you are as a person is reflected in like what your thoughts are. They were very much of that old school style of psychology. And so they were like, yeah, it sounds like you have like some sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies. And so then he started having even more violent thoughts, and it got worse and worse and worse, until eventually he started picturing in detail how he would like kill his dog or his wife, and like these really terrible thoughts. And he was, meanwhile, while he's going through like having these thoughts, having this like imagery in his head, this like imagined scenario, he's losing his mind. I mean, he is so stressed out. He doesn't want to do any of this. And so he starts losing weight. He stops going outside because he doesn't want to like see anybody because he's afraid he might hurt someone. That therapist eventually stops returning his calls, which, by the way, can we talk about like what an awful therapist this person is? Stops returning his calls, which sends him into an even deeper spiral. And then finally, at the begging of his wife, she's like, go see one more therapist, go see one more. And she looks up this other guy, and he goes, this other guy. And this other guy is very much of the new style of psychology, which is like, your thoughts are really kind of meaningless. They don't really implement too much in terms of like your actions. They're just these little things that kind of, sit in your brain for a second, then leave. And he's like, oh, you're having like violent thoughts. And he's like, yeah. And he's like, here. And he like grabs a knife and he like gives it to him. And he's like, here. And he like holds it to, he's like, yeah, go ahead. And the guy's like, what do you do? He's like, I could kill you. And he's like, no, you won't. And then it kind of comes to be that it turns out he actually has a very rare form of OCD. So a lot of people think that OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, right? A lot of people think that like obsessive compulsive disorder is just people who are very clean or very like have very like, they like right angles. They're very type A, right? But what it actually is it is a compulsion tied to an obsession. So an obsession is usually something that someone is intensely disgusted by or intensely afraid of. So in the case of like those people you see who like wash their hands 50, 60 times a day, and that sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not. We're talking about like these are people who are premeditating, and they're constantly thinking about how there could be germs everywhere. And they're so disgusted by that or so afraid of that they are taking an action. They have a compulsion tied to that. Or you'll see people who will like flip the light switch off. They are like 3 times. And you would think that they are obsessed with the number 3, but it's actually kind of the opposite. They are in fact disgusted by the number 3, and it is something that they are so afraid of, and they have such a profound dislike for, that they believe by taking an action like flipping the light switch off 1, 2, 3 times, it will protect them or their loved ones or things like that. So they have an obsession tied to a compulsive behavior, and that's what OCD is. Turns out this guy had sort of a mental version of that. He was so disgusted by violence, and he was so like, he disliked violence so much that he started compulsively thinking about it, and it started permeating every aspect of his life. And he could not stop thinking these violent things because he was so afraid of them, or he had such a so ironically, this guy who was afraid that he was becoming a serial killer is actually morally a little bit better than the rest of us. Like, because us, when we see like a violent image, it comes in, it sits for a second, and it just leaves, but this guy, it sits with him and he premeditates on it and can't stop thinking about it because he's so disgusted by it. So it's a very interesting story. And if you guys are interested, I will give basically a day's worth of attendance. So 5 hours worth of like Sochi attendance, right? for watching the dark, listening, it's a podcast, you can't watch it, listening to the Dark Thoughts podcast. And then if you just write me like a 1-page summary of what you thought about it, I don't need it to be like, crazy intense or anything like that. You just send me an email about 1 page in length. That's like, hey, I thought this was really fascinating. I think that this is a story that would be interesting for me with my clients. Like, the coolest part of the story I thought was this. I don't need it to be like a summary of what happened in the podcast. I've listened to it, so I'm good on that. But like, if you tell me what you think of it, I'll give you 5 hours worth of credit. So if you have been absent, it will wipe one of your absences away. And then the same thing is true for the second podcast, which is also really cool. This one is about a guy who has, in my opinion, what is the most terrifying disease on this planet, called locked-in syndrome, where essentially he became catatonic, but still conscious. So he was completely paralyzed, and even his vital signs seemed like he was brain dead, but he was completely awake the whole time, completely conscious the entire time, basically trapped in his own body. And he talks about how he was able to restructure his thoughts. He comes out of it, by the way. This guy's actually a very famous motivational speaker now. Married, living a normal life. But he was locked in, I think, for like over a decade for sure. I can't remember how many years he was kind of trapped in his own body. But he tells these stories about how he would basically go on adventures in his brain. He would create these scenarios and go on these imagined scenarios and stuff. So this one, I would save this, guys, if you were going to listen to this one. We are going to talk about imagery in a couple days. That's one of our techniques that we also use to help our clients. And this one pairs really well with our imagery lesson. But this one right here pairs really well with today and tomorrow. So if you guys are interested, you can get 10 hours. That is 2 days of attendance. For those of you who have missed class ever, if you have missed 2 days of class, this is just free. It takes, all you got to do is listen to 2 episodes of a podcast, write me 1 page each on what you think about them. And if you thought it was fascinating, or if you were like, I thought this was dumb and I'm not interested in this story, but give me my 5 hours, I'm great. I'll do it. Just tell me a little bit about like what you thought of the stories and how you think it might help you as like a trainer. Any questions on that? Actually, just the extra credit side of things. Questions? Charlie, I don't know if you've ever missed a day.
I don't think so.
I wish I could. I can't use it to points. I'm not allowed to do that on like our level, So
It also sounds interesting though. I mean, just to like listen to it,
It is still super fascinating. Like, trust me. And honestly, what I've had students do in the past, and this is not advice, but what I have had students do in the past is like they'll keep this in mind in the back of their brain, and then like towards the end of the program, if they ever happen to miss a day, they're like, ha, and they'll come back and they'll do it then. Even if it's not in this mod. I don't have a due date on this. It's extra credit. So, yeah. So anyway, if you want to make up some hours, guys, it's a good way to do it. And super fascinating stories. Listen to them. It's so cool. It is. Oh, I will say, and then have a laugh for me. Because the beginning is so like the 2 hosts of this podcast are like your classic like podcast personalities, where it's like, hello everyone and welcome to today's episode of Invisibilia. So today we're gonna be talking. It's so funny. Like, it's like, oh man, you guys are like walking stereotypes. Anyway, I think that's funny. So let's look at behavior therapy. Getting back to sort of what we're looking at here. So like I said, this is taking principles of psychology derived from the ideas of like how we as humans tend to behave and how we, act, right? And how we can sort of use that to kind of hack our behaviors, which is really how I kind of like to think about it. I think it's like brain hacking in a way, So we want to look at the perspective of this idea of like learned habits. Like we all have learned habits, like I don't know about you guys, but like I pick up certain aspects from like my friends all the time. Like I'll just absorb, like when I'm around certain friends, I will absorb like parts of their personality, like my buddy Will. He always like his big thing, he uses the word buddy all the time, and like I don't say that much, unless I'm around Will. And then every day it's like, what's up, buddy? Hey, buddy, you know, just this weird thing that you sort of like absorb, right? And so, you know, and that's because like there's something that results in like a trigger. And you go through a routine and you have this consequence. In this case, it's like a, you know, the consequence is like, oh, that's fun, you know, it gets a laugh, it's funny, right? And so that consequence reinforces the behavior. So then I start doing it even more and more and often, you know. My favorite version of this that I always tell people, for a little while there, and I had to break this habit because I was ashamed of myself. For a little while there, I started using the word like brah a lot, like ironically, like I thought it was funny. I'd be like, "What's up, brah?" like a, you know, weird like over the top, you know, kind of surfer personality, which doesn't really match up with me, you know, which is why it was funny. And then I started doing it like so often that one day, like I used it very organically, and I was like, oh no. So that is, you know, a behavior that needed to be broken. So let's talk about like what this three-step is, what these three steps are, what the three steps in every one of our sort of learned behaviors are. So at first, and by the way, this is actually going to come back in Capstone. You guys are going to talk about this with Mo as well, but NASM will relabel it ever so slightly as the ABCs. But basically, you have what's called an antecedent, which is basically like it's a trigger, right? This is an event that triggers some type of routine, right? That triggers a behavior. And so like an individual has a hard day at work. So because they have a hard day at work, that triggers them to seek comfort in some capacity, right? And then they have, we call it the organismic reaction, which is basically your behavior, right? So you have an antecedent into a behavior, right? And then that behavior is associated with the event. And it's like that individual might seek out some type of like junk food, and that's their version of like comfort, right? So they have a hard day, they seek comfort, and then they, you know, they go grab like a candy bar from like the cupboard or something, right? And then there are consequences to our behaviors, right? Like you know, like Newton said, every action equal and opposite reaction, right? So we have a consequence, or like this is our outcome, right? And the outcome is like whatever happens from, you know, that organismic behavior, right? So the consumption of high energy foods results in like an excess of calories, and then those calories result in, you know, excessive adipose tissue, which could, you know, affect like health and things like that. So that is sort of the three-step process that we kind of go through. Again, go back to Pavlov's dog, right? It's like you ring a bell, the dog's mouth starts watering because it thinks it's about to get food. And then like the consequence is, you know, it makes it easier to eat that food, right? So it's drawing like an association from one thing to the next. So this is our ABCs. Now, if you ever want to understand this really fully, and I absolutely think you should, because I love behavior therapy, and I think it's one of the most powerful tools that we have as trainers to really help our clients with their behaviors, you should read a book called The Power of Habit. This book is fantastic. I'm a huge fan. You can get it used for friggin', you know, $7. And I like I said, I love it. Let's see here. What is the, there's the paperback version, brand new, $10. And you can get them 250 of them used from $1.97. This is cheap book with a delivery fee. Okay, so about $5. So I love this book. It's really, really great, and it explains the idea of these habit loops. The whole book is basically talking about habits, and it talks a lot about behavior therapy. And so he relabels it a little bit. He relabels it ever so slightly. Rather than calling it in like an antecedent, an organismic, and consequence, he calls it, you have a cue, a routine, and a reward. So your cue kicks the brain into automatic mode and tells you which habit of your habits to use. Then you go through a routine, which could be physical, it could be mental, it could be emotional. And then you get like some type of reward, which is like, you know, the prize saying like, hey, we should do this loop more often. Now, again, reward, I think like in I'm not as huge a fan of like the term reward. I think consequence works a lot better because reward kind of is really associated only with positive stuff. But like in this case, it could be like, you know, Aladdin style, like bad reward, right? So like this could be the kind of reward we're not exactly looking for. But we have a cue, habit, and then we have a consequence of some type, right? And so there's a lot of different versions of this out here, right? You can see here's like the, you know, the cue is maybe feeling depressed, and then the routine is like drinking alcohol, and the reward is like you feel better temporarily, but then eventually that often leads to like, you know, often leads to negative you know, feelings of, you know, feeling bad again, and it happens like over and over and over again. It kind of feeds back into itself. And that's kind of what we call like a positive feedback loop, which is a little bit different than this like habit loop, but it's an example. So how do you interrupt that? Well, if, you know, you talk to people who have gone through like Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, they will talk about like what's going on in their lives, and they will, you know, draw positive associations with conversations and a life without alcohol. And so instead, they'll have like a depressed feeling, talk to someone about it, which will make them feel good. And now, whenever they have that same original cue, they have a much healthier consequence coming afterwards, right? And there's a million different versions of this, right? And what's great in the book is, the reason the book is so good and the reason I love it so much is it is filled with really fun stories that highlight basically what it is that what they're talking about, and they use these really interesting, you know, stories to do it. So yesterday I was talking about Febreze, right? So, you know, if you want to reinforce the habit of like cleaning your room consistently, right? Taking like, you have like a trigger of some type, which might be, you know, a certain time of day, maybe, you know, or maybe it is like when you see a certain thing, right? And then you will go through this routine of like cleaning, which generally, like, you know, people don't exactly find stimulating. So it's not exactly like a reward. But if you want to reinforce this habit and make cleaning more fun for you, taking a moment to just go and like pat yourself on the back, and like turn around, take a look at this clean room that you just made, and just go, nice work, me, right? That little mental pat on the back will reinforce it and eventually draw a positive association with this action, right? And that's what Febreze did. Febreze capitalized on that. And so they started telling people, spray this stuff that smells good at the end when you're done cleaning a room. It should be the last thing that you do. And so then like people would go through, they'd have like a cue, which again, maybe it'd be like the kids leave for school, right? And so then you start cleaning the house. And then like every time you complete a little bit of your action, right, you go through the routine, you reinforce that habit by like giving yourself this dopamine of like positive like smells, right? And so it makes your brain go, yeah, that was awesome, I should do that more often, and you get addicted to it. Let's look at like gambling, right? Gambling is the exact same thing. You have a cue, which is like, you know, generally for some people, it might even, you know, for real gambling addicts, it's like even just like walking into a casino and like smelling like cigarettes or something, right? And that triggers this thing in your brain that goes, we should go do this right now, right? And then you sit down at like a slot machine, right? And then you pull that lever and it goes through like this, you get all this, like you get the whirls and the dings and the bells and the whistles and like all this stuff happens, which is kind of like pleasant and kind of fun. And then like it might go bong, 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 and you get this like big rush of like dopamine where you're like, I did it, right? And it makes sense that like people can get very addicted to gambling, because remember, our brains are very much affected by like the chemicals that we bring into our body. Looking at bad food, right? Maybe you have like a cue, which is just like seeing a package of Oreos, right? And you have a routine of like peeling the wrapper back, grabbing a couple of cookies, twisting them, getting the sugar. And then all of a sudden you go through the routine and you slam your brain with like a whole bunch of sugar that makes your brain go, oh my God, we got sugar from doing this thing. We should just do that thing all the time, right? And that is sort of what we talk about. We talk about behavior loops. So there's a lot of behavior loops here, and that's really what we're looking at today. So this was originally presented, like I said, by, I don't remember Pavlov's first name, but blah, blah, blah Pavlov, when he studied like dogs and ringing the dinner bell, right? And so the idea is they call it classical conditioning. You're basically conditioning your brain in this very kind of old school method here, right? And it's learning associations through it's learning through associations between an uncontrolled stimuli and conditioned stimuli. So basically, unconditioned stimuli are like things that like are automatically occurring that you're going to just experience in life. You know, maybe it's like somebody cutting you off in traffic. Like there's, especially if you live in LA, there's no way to avoid it. You know, it's going to happen eventually, right? That's unconditioned stimulus. But then there's also conditioned stimuli, which is like triggering like a conditioned response, right? Something that you have purposefully sort of like put infrastructure in place to sort of create, right? So an unconditioned stimulus often result in unconditioned responses. So these are responses that tend to be automatic, right? So if you smell your favorite smell your favorite food, you're probably going to start salivating, kind of like Pavlov's dog, right? And so like that action, right? If I like right now, if I told you to start imagining like pizza, like your favorite pizza, salty, greasy, like, you know, I want you to imagine like taking a bite of that. If I make you do that, chances are your mouth will actually, like the parts of your brain that think about this food are going to start going through the preparatory phases of actually consuming that food, you know? Have you guys ever, oh man, I remember I used to love Warheads when I was a kid. You guys remember those candies? You remember Warheads? I don't even know if they're still around.
Yeah.
I loved them when I was a kid. Yeah. And man, I remember like I used to eat those all the time, and they cause your mouth to like, I mean, just like swell up. And if I think too much about a Warhead, I can cramp the side of my cheek up. I haven't had one in years, you know. I kind of feel like I'm doing it right now. So that is what we talk about. We say like an unconditioned stimuli. Unconditioned stimuli results in an unconditioned response. We also have conditioned stimuli. And this is associated with an unconditioned stimulus that triggers a conditioned response, right? And so for example, let's say your alarm goes off. It goes off at the same time every day. And so eventually that becomes associated with getting out of bed. Does anybody in here, how many of you guys like wake up at the same time every day? Your alarm is set for the exact same time every day.
With an alarm or without an alarm?
Well, that's actually what I'm leading into. Do you get up at the same time every day without an alarm?
More or less, yeah. I always wake up around 5 or 6 a.m.
Yeah. All right. That's so funny. Yeah, that's so funny. I thought of you even when I like said this question. I was like, oh, Charlie's got like, you know, you get the military routine.
And even when I go to sleep, like let's say like 1 or 2 a.m., I still wake up at that time.
Yeah. So that's the thing, right? And what's funny about that is you're like, what? How the heck am I going through like a routine with like where I wake up at the same time? My brain's asleep. There's no stimulus that's like affecting me. At least you wouldn't think there is. But we all have this internal clock called your circadian rhythm that knows instinctively like what time of day it is. This is actually one of the reasons why staying up late and not sleeping at a regular, like going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time, this is actually kind of why this is bad for our brains, because we are like biologic creatures that have the ability to know what time of day it is based on how much light is hitting our brain. Your brain will make, oh, there's a lot of light out, we should make like stay awake hormones. And if it starts to get very dark for like a very long time, your brain will go, oh, it's nighttime, we should make go to sleep hormones. And that is sort of like, we call that our circadian rhythm. You can see here, it's a little more complicated than I'm laying it out to be. But if you actually look at your circadian rhythm, you can see, you know, there's lots of like little pieces to it, you know? And so you have like high alertness at these times. This is why generally, and this is just a general rule of thumb, do not take this as like black and white, you know, information, but generally they say like 10 to 6 is sort of the ideal, like go to bed at 10, get up at 6. That's like the classic version. But you can see like where, you know, look at the things that start happening, right? Like melatonin secretion starts a couple hours after you sleep, right? Your bowel movements are suppressed, which is good because you don't have to worry about that while you're asleep. You have your deepest sleep somewhere around 2 a.m. Your body temperature gets pretty low. And then your body starts to realize like, oh, it's, you know, there's light coming in, we should start waking up, right? So then like your blood pressure starts to spike, your melatonin shuts down, you're probably gonna have to go to the bathroom pretty early in the morning. You start secreting things like your testosterone and things like that. You experience like high alertness. And then like here, right in this time, you have your best coordination, which is why they've actually looked at like working out somewhere between like noon and 2. And they found that that's actually oftentimes where people will actually perform a little bit better in the gym, which is kind of funny, like right in this area here. And then like you can see like you get your highest blood pressure and then it starts to slow down. And yeah, it kind of goes through this whole process here, right? And that's sort of our classic circadian rhythm. Now, obviously your rhythm is going to be like different, right? Here's how to optimize it, I guess. Your rhythm is going to be a little bit different based on like what time you normally go to bed and what time you normally get up. But if you consistently get up frequently, you start to build an association with this time. And so these hormones that are being created in your brain, Charlie, are what are waking you up. Your brain has like an association drawn with a habit when you get to a certain part of your circadian rhythm, which means you could go to bed at any time and your body will naturally wake up around that other time. This is also one of the reasons, guys, why the snooze button is so freaking bad for you. This is actually, hold on. This is legitimately true. I do not use my phone as my alarm. I have a freaking actual old man alarm clock. And I recommend that everybody else does the same. You should totally use a regular old alarm clock. Because like, you know, your phone is way too easy to hit the snooze button on. And like, at least with this one doesn't have one. It has the ability to like turn the clock off. But like, I know if I do that, I'm, you know, probably going to go back to sleep and there'll be other types of consequences. So, you know, snooze buttons are terrible for us because not only do they reset your sleep schedule over and over again, which only makes you more tired, it also starts to draw an association between like a behavior and a stimulus, right? So a conditioned stimulus would be like an alarm going off and you getting out of bed. So you are creating what we call a conditioned response. You're learning through repeated exposure to a stimulus. The only alarm that I shouldn't say I don't ever use my phone for my alarm. That's actually not 100% true. Sometimes what I will do is I will, and I don't do this anymore because unfortunately I don't have a bathroom that's like directly connected to my room anymore. But I used to put my alarm on top of my phone on top of my toothbrush case. And so like I would have to like turn my phone and then my toothbrush would be right there. And so that would encourage me to not like, you know, want to go back to bed or something, even if I was like tired, right? So I have like a conditioned response, which is where like, you know, you repeatedly expose yourself until eventually it becomes routine. Another one this is why people like their morning coffee so much, right? Your brain goes, oh, I don't want to get up out of bed, but I do love caffeine. And so then it like gets you up out of bed. If it's a motivation to kind of do something you may not necessarily want to do, that's a conditioned response, right? And eventually we'll draw positive associations with this. So that's sort of our classical conditioning. Now, we aren't going to typically, you know, classical conditioning is pretty good, but we want to have a little bit more control over things. We want to use this to sort of optimize our life, right? We want to use this to create positive changes. And so this is where we start talking about operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is just a little bit different. This involves learning that occurs by making associations between your voluntary behaviors and their consequences. So operant conditioning is sort of the more intellectual, more evolved version of classical conditioning, where it's like, you know, like nobody wants to like file their taxes, you know, like nobody wants to do all that paperwork. It's boring, right? But like me, I associate tax day with like a big freaking check coming through the mail in a couple weeks. You know, like I have drawn a positive association with this kind of annoying act, right? This is the, like I said, mental pat on the back that you kind of want to give yourself, right? So like, yeah, nobody likes doing laundry, you know, but like, have you guys like crawled into bed with like clean sheets lately? It is delightful. There's actually the brother of the Crash Course guy, Hank. His brother John also does like a series of educational videos, but they're usually a little more like philosophical or literature in nature. And I love he did this like short little 3-minute fun video where he was like a letter to he's like a letter to my younger self. And I was like, hey, younger self, wooden cutting boards are not meant to go in the dishwasher. It's not that they just randomly explode one day. That's actually not good for them. And I was like, also, younger self, you can wash your sheets as often as you want. There is no consequence to that. And you get to enjoy the feeling of clean sheets on your bed as often as possible. And I was like, I'm with you on that. So you start to draw like positive associations between things, right? That's operant conditioning. Now, we as coaches can use operant conditioning to help our clients, right? Coaches and clients can identify target behaviors, and then we can use operant conditioning to increase those targeted behaviors. And we do that by drawing a positive association between certain behaviors and their consequences. So even just giving your client like a high five for a really good set is an example of like operant conditioning. Like, come on, keep it up. 10 more seconds. 8, 3, 2, 1. Nice work. Get on up. And then boom, give them a high five. You crush it. Give them shower them with compliments. Tell them that they did great. They start drawing positive associations with like that burning that in their chest, the lactic acid building up, the burning in their arms, whatever activity it was that you had them doing, like they start drawing a positive association between those two things, right? So for example, if someone starts to learn to associate a certain time of day with going to the gym to exercise, whenever that time of day starts to roll around, they're going to instinctively want to like get out the door. This is also why I encourage you guys to do this yourselves, but also encourage your clients to work out at the same time every day. My clients, I'm a stickler about it. I get clients all the time who are like, hey, can we meet at like 7 a.m. this time? And then like, I don't know, like 9 a.m. the next time. And I'm like, can you do 7 a.m. both times or 9 a.m. both times? And they're like, yeah, I guess I could. And that's like, great. And that's what we're going to do. And I try to create the habit, right? Again, getting up at different times every day is a less optimal way to get your brain to instinctively do stuff. There's nothing better than when you are not tired. At least it's the worst when you're sleepy. But waking up at the same time every day, like feeling good and just like getting out of bed and starting your day. Once that becomes like a habit, it's a very healthy, positive feeling. So how do we do this? If we want to create as much operant conditioning as possible, right? We want to like draw positive associations with like healthy things and things like that. How do we do that? Well, there's a couple different techniques out there, and all of them actually can be very effective. You just need to figure out which one's going to be the most effective for your client. So one of the techniques is positive reinforcement. This is probably my favorite one, but this is the addition of positive consequences after a targeted behavior. So your client does something good, and so you reward them with a positive consequence or a positive reinforcer. So a client, gets to have like a cheat meal at the end of a successful week, right? That's a great example of positive reinforcement. It's like, hey, you really crushed it this week. Let's do it. Let's have like a cheat meal. Now, if you look at the food journal and like normally you deliver cheat meals on Sundays, right? But you look at your client's like log and then it's like, hey, like we didn't have like a good meal. It's like we already fell off the wagon on Wednesday this week, right? We haven't really earned that cheat meal, right? So they don't get that positive reinforcement. And then that sort of starts to move into these other versions of consequences where it's like, yeah, no, we don't get to have a cheat meal this week because we fell off the wagon on Wednesday, right? So that is actually what we call a response cost. And we'll look at that here in just a second. So punishment is another method, right? Punishment is the addition of an aversive stimulus, so something your client wants to avoid, following a behavior that you're trying to decrease. So if a client does something you don't want them to do, and then they receive punishment afterwards, what will happen is they will start to draw a negative association with this untargeted behavior, this thing that they were trying to avoid. So maybe a client has to perform 30 minutes of extra cardio in response to not following that nutritional plan. So We didn't remove something, we added something negative. That's what punishment is. So this is a little bit different, right? Like, obviously not getting to receive a cheat meal seems like punishment for falling off the diet, right? But that's actually not an example of punishment, because what we're doing is we're removing something positive, right? Punishment is adding something negative. So punishment is probably my least favorite of all the techniques, just because like it's not exactly a good relationship. You know, you're trying to keep this client happy. I mean, it can be an effective tool, make no mistake, but it's definitely not one that like I typically engage in. But yeah, it'd be like running laps in response to, doing something the wrong way. Man, I used to, classic example of like punishment that did work, by the way. It was actually very effective. When I played baseball, I had this really bad habit of dropping my back leg backwards. Like I would try to get like more torque on the ball. So as I would like twist, I would step my leg. And it was a really bad habit. And my coach took his ball bag, his bat bag, and he laid it behind me whenever I was like at practice. And he was like, "Don't you step on my bag." And every time I would like twist and I'd step on his bag, I'd have to do push-ups and then run a lap. So I'd be punished for stepping on his bag. And it worked. It totally drew this association. I had a targeted behavior that he was trying to decrease. So he added a punishment in the way whenever I did this untargeted behavior, right? Now, there is also negative reinforcement, which is different from punishment. Negative reinforcement is the removal of a negative consequence in order to increase a targeted behavior. So punishment was adding something negative because you did something that you don't want to do, right? Negative reinforcement is I will remove something negative if you do something I do want you to do. So a trainer might remove a client's least favorite exercise from like a training program because they had an excellent week of training and they didn't miss any of their sessions. So if they did what we want them to do, which is like going to all their training sessions, and we remove something that, typically is negative in their eyes, right? The classic example of negative reinforcement, my favorite example of this that you guys experience regularly without maybe knowing it, is the alarm in your car that dings when you don't put your seatbelt on. So when you don't put your seatbelt on and your car is going bong, 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 and it just doesn't stop, right? And you're like, fine. And then you do what the car wants you to do. You have done the targeted behavior, so then it removes this annoying thing. That's negative reinforcement. So you are reinforcing something by removing negative consequences. Positive reinforcement would be like if you put the seatbelt on and then your car was like, excellent, here's your ice cream cone. And then punishment would be, you gotta like have a behavior that we want to decrease. That's hard to think of in the car analogy. I don't know. I can't think of an example. If your car wanted you to stop rolling your window down, punishment would be like if the car like, slapped you in the face every time you roll the window down. This car's like Knight Rider. So then we've also got response cost. Response cost is what we were talking about earlier. So response cost is a little bit different. This is the removal of a positive reinforcer to decrease the probability of the response that removal follows, right? So a trainer would remove the reward associated with success in response to an untargeted behavior. So if you did something that we don't want to do, right? Like we did an untargeted behavior. Again, let's say it's like going to Carl's Jr. or something, right? We would remove the reward associated with that. So earlier when we talked about how like we don't get to have a cheat meal, right? That's removing the positive thing because we did something we didn't want to do. So you have basically, think of like a four-way box here, guys. You have targeted behaviors and untargeted behaviors, right? And then you have rewards, and you have like basically, we can think of them as punishments, or what we'll call them consequences, right? So we have rewards or consequences. So positive reinforcement is doing a targeted behavior gets you a reward, right? Punishment is doing an untargeted behavior gets you a consequence. Negative reinforcement is doing a targeted behavior removes a consequence. And response cost is doing an untargeted behavior removes a reward. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm sure I can find a chart. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Operant conditioning chart. Gonna work. Yeah, there we go. Someone on the internet has my brain. I've never seen this laid out in chart form, but sure enough. So you can kind of see things we want to have happen more often. We have positive or negative. Things we want to have less often. We have positive and negative. And so it either goes, top to bottom or side to side. So that is operant conditioning in a nutshell. And these are tools that you can use to like help your clients, typically guys, we're going to spend most of our time, we're working with our clients. We got to keep this person's paying us, right? Most of the time we are going to spend time positively reinforcing things. And then oftentimes we'll do like negative reinforcement with our clients as well. These are the two that I typically spend with my clients. And negative reinforcement, right? I will remove something annoying in response to a targeted behavior, right? So like a good example of that, honestly, is if you were to continue, imagine if, the text message that I send out every day to let you guys know that like the calls are up and stuff. Imagine if I made you start responding to those. And then I just texted you every 5 minutes until I got a response. Right. And then eventually you're like, fine, yes, I'm getting it. Good God, I'm here. Right. And you're so annoyed. Right. Well, as soon as you text me back, I stop texting you. Like that's the negative reinforcement. This is actually something you can do with your clients. That is like, actually pretty helpful, and not punishment. So I don't dislike negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is actually a tool that I think can be very effective. So how do we apply all this, right? Let's practically get this into our sessions, right? Well, first thing we're going to do, there's a lot of different techniques out there. There's contingency contracting, which is basically setting up an agreement between you and the client and being like, all right, this is what I want you to do. If you don't do it, this is going to happen. If you do it, this is going to happen, right? So you actually lay it out ahead of time and work with the client to create targeted behaviors and detail like a plan, right? There's pre-macking, which is a kind of a fun one. It's basically where you're setting up things to happen automatically because they are already near something that you normally do. There's stimulus control, which is basically removing temptation. Modeling, which is like you should be engaging in this as well with the client because then they can see it and that'll reinforce targeted behaviors. And relaxation training, which is outside of the realm of behaviors, a little bit more inside the realm of like, our thoughts and actions and thoughts and feelings. So contingency contracting, love contingency contracting. I don't exactly call it that with my clients. I just call it like, a friggin' agreement, but like contingency contracting, super effective tool here. And this is basically where you are going to use a detailed agreement or a contract to specify the expectations between the client and the trainer, the plans for how we're going to achieve those expectations, and any contingencies for like untargeted behaviors, right? So how do you do this? Well, you are going to set up and establish your targeted behaviors first. So the first thing you're going to do is the client and the trainer are going to establish like what the appropriate behaviors are. You're going to talk to your client and say, here's what I want you to do, right? Your client's probably going to help you with this, right? They're going to say, I want to do this. And you're going to say, great. Then, you want to achieve like, let's say like muscle gain. Well, then your targeted behavior is to get in here and do this workout, 4 times a week, right? So we establish like our targeted behaviors, and then you as the coach are going to continue like monitoring their progress. You're going to continue like checking with your client, like, hey, did you go to the gym today? Hey, did you go to the gym today? Right? You're going to check in with them regularly. Now you should be monitoring your clients' progress with them. I just realized these slides are going to move forward. I was about to get ahead of myself. So establish the targeted behaviors, right? You and the client and the professional are going to establish what those behaviors are. And you're going to monitor progress. Now, you should be doing this as the coach because like it is going to be a little bit of like social pressure when you do that. And we know that social pressure is really effective for increasing targeted behaviors. People respond well when there's sort of a person looking over them, be like, hey, did you do what you said you're going to do? Right. So check in with them regularly. But self-monitoring leads to even higher levels of adherence. This goes back to what we talked about yesterday and the day before in class, right? And we talked about it in nutrition. I mean, by this point, you guys should all have a pretty clear understanding that like food journals work, and workout journals work. And so like we do encourage self-monitoring. It's been shown to be very, 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 very effective. And I think I underlined this because it's definitely going to be a homework question. Now, once we as the coach are then, once sort of these actions have happened, whether they were targeted or untargeted, right? Maybe they did something we didn't want to have happen. We are then going to deliver the consequences that we set up in our contingency contract, right? So we established target behaviors and we associated like, all right, so you are going to go to the gym 5 times this week, right? And then we're going to check in again on Monday. And if by Monday we haven't been to the gym 5 times, then we're going to deliver some type of consequences. You're going to have to start your session with 30 burpees, right? So that'd be like an example of like punishment. But you can see here, right, we're going to deliver the consequences. So positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, response costs, all of those are ways to deliver consequences, right? We just want to make sure that we consider like what the ground rules are before doing this. So you should talk to your client. It's like, don't say like, hey, I want you to go to the gym 5 times this week, and then like leave it up to chance. And your client shows up and it's like, did you go to the gym? And they're like, no, I couldn't find the time. And it's like, all right, well, then you need to do 30 burpees. And they're like, why? What? I'm an adult. You're not going to punish me. Like, don't do that if you have not talked about it. Like, set it up, figure out what an appropriate punishment according to your client is, right? So we can see here's like our ground rules here, right? Reward your client. Oh, and then one of the most important ones is actually this first one. Reward your clients immediately after the execution of desired like behaviors, right? So like this is the same thing. Here's something that might that you guys should be aware of. Talk about training dogs. I don't know if anybody in here has like a dog, or if you've ever done the classic like rub the dog's nose in urine thing. So here's the thing. That can be an effective method, although I think most animal behavior specialists don't recommend it because it's so traumatic. I think it's over the top. I think they think that it's over the top. But if you're going to punish your dog for like crapping on the carpet or something, when you get home from work, they have no idea that that's why they're being punished by that point. Dogs' memory span is too short. They're not smart enough to draw an association between this thing that they did hours ago or even an hour ago and now. So they just have no idea why you're yelling at them. Now, if you do it immediately, the minute it happens, you're more likely to help draw an association between those actions where the dog goes, oh, I should not do this because there's a negative consequence associated with it. If it's immediate, it's easier to draw a connection. If you do it hours later, dogs just aren't smart enough to like draw that connection. So based on that, God dang it. Sorry, I need to, hold on a second. My coffee is attacking me. Same thing is true with like our clients, right? We want to deliver our consequences as quickly to either targeted or untargeted behaviors as possible. And so like start at top of the session, right? That way it's in the front of their brain. Use small rewards pretty frequently. That's a big one. Use fair rewards. Make sure you're like being adequate here. Like don't go over the top with like your punishments or, removal of consequence or anything like that. Like don't go crazy about that. Make sure that like they are fair. And, as long as you're working with your client to determine like what these are, that's going to work just fine. I mean, most of the time, the stuff that we're end up doing is like, all right, well, you have to do a little bit of extra cardio after our session today. That's sort of the most common one. Or, like I said, like we're going to have to skip our cheat meal this week, right? That's honestly the most common stuff. It's not like we're like, you didn't do what we said we were going to do. Probably not going to have a great relationship with your client if you're doing something like that. And then also specify any of the contingencies that are going to occur, based on like, whether or not this is happening. So that is, establish targeted behaviors, monitor their progress regularly. And then you are also going to like deliver consequences. Often we're going to use positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, but sometimes there is punishment, sometimes there's a response cost, right? And it's like, well, you don't get to do this awesome thing because we didn't do this, right? But then we also want to maximize generalization. This is our last step. And this is, I don't know if this is actually necessarily like a step as much as it is something you should just be doing, but maximizing generalization. Generalization is where like now this has just become a habit in general, right? So this is the maintenance of behaviors over time. Hopefully you guys, associate your alarm with getting up out of bed rather than getting back into bed, right? And hopefully that's just a habit by this point, So we should ensure that our client's ability to adhere to this program becomes like very natural, right? This is just something that happens in general. That's what we're looking for here, rather than something that they have to continue putting effort in. Because again, we kind of talked about this yesterday. Effort only goes so far. You only have like so much ability to continue putting effort into something, So instead, we want to just make it as natural as possible, make it part of our life. This is why we're going to talk about pre-macking next. Pre-macking is actually a really good example of this. But before I do, I want to show you guys a little bit about like what contingency contracting really looks like here. Again, these are two of the NASM videos here that actually really highlight this super well. Hold on a second. Let me make sure it's the right one. Hush. Is it just this guy the whole time? Yeah, that's not what I want. This one.
A fun and rewarding strategy for wellness professionals to help clients make consistent progress towards their goals is often in the form of a behavioral contract. Behavioral contracts are not legal contracts, like the kind of contracts a client might sign to determine the amount they will pay for a service or how many sessions they are signing up for, but rather they are focused on motivating clients to take specific actions that will help them with their goals. In behavioral contracting, there are 4 distinct phases: establishing target behaviors, monitoring progress, delivering consequences, and maximizing generalization. Since behavioral contracts are not legal contracts, they can be both verbal and written. In the video you're about to see, you will see a wellness professional who also happens to be a certified personal trainer with their client discussing a verbal contract to motivate the client to meet their goals. Since this is the first discussion of a behavioral contract with the client, the wellness professional will be establishing a target behavior, determining how they will monitor progress and determine what consequences will be delivered. But we will not see the 4th phase of maximizing generalization, as that is something that needs to be evaluated over time.
Great job with your workout today.
Thanks. It was another good one.
So how do you think things are coming so far?
Okay, I guess.
All right. Well, it's been 1 month since we started working together, and today is going to be our assessment. Now, initially, you had said your weight loss goal was 40 pounds, but it looks like you've only lost about 1 pound since our last session. I'm curious how your cardio work is coming outside of our sessions.
Honestly, it's difficult for me to find motivation. I don't really have time to hit the gym, and there isn't anyone here to really push me through it. I don't know when the last time was when I came in on my own.
Totally understandable. It's really tough to motivate yourself. What do you think if we maybe drop a contract to help work with those motivation levels? We could offer a reward if you meet your goals. What do you think? Yeah?
Okay. What did you have in mind?
How about we start with 10,000 steps a day?
Okay. I think that could be achievable.
All right. And I want you to make sure that you share your progress with me daily.
Done.
I will go on, I'll check your progress, and if it looks like you've met your goals, then we can offer a fun reward for the upcoming session.
Okay.
I know you mentioned that you like basketball and rock climbing, so if you meet your step goal, then we can incorporate 30 minutes of one of those into our session that day. What do you think?
That sounds awesome.
Okay, and if you exceed your goal by 3,000 steps, then we can do an hour of yoga.
Excellent.
All right.
I think I can definitely make these goals.
Fantastic, let's draft up a contract.
Now that you've seen a verbal behavioral contract being created with a client, you can see how each phase was discussed. The wellness professional established a target behavior of 10,000 steps per day. Then they determined how they will monitor their client's progress by using an activity tracker with a phone app that has sharing capabilities. Finally, they decided on how to deliver the consequences or rewards for meeting the target behaviors.
So they're definitely focusing on positive reinforcement in that example, but your contingency contract could go even further. You could say, okay, if you meet your goal, we're going to do this 30 minutes of rock climbing, 30 minutes of basketball or yoga or whatever. If you don't meet your goal, we're going to have some type of, and then, you know, we can work with our client to maybe talk about like what a negative reinforcer would be. So like we would remove something positive, like something else that they do. Like maybe they're already doing like yoga like once a month, and it's like, we're gonna have to skip our yoga session and we're gonna turn that into a cardio session, right? So now like we're removing it. So it's like, they don't, you know, there's a risk involved. Like, I don't want to lose this thing that I enjoy. Or we would say like, we're gonna deliver like a punishment, right? And it's gonna be, you know, our session is going to have to eliminate, we're gonna have to do a 0 rest session, which is, you know, gonna be really brutal and a little bit tougher. Is that pretty clear, guys? That's contingency contract. I'd say that is right there, probably the most common method if you're really like, you know, using behavior therapy a lot. This is probably the one that you're gonna spend a lot of time with. Is that one pretty clear to everybody? All righty. So let's take a look at our next one here. So one of the other methods that we've got is called pre-macking. This is kind of a fun one. It's not a real word. It's just named after the guy who sort of came up with it. David Premack. But basically, this is you guys have probably done pre-macking without realizing it. But it involves pairing a targeted behavior with a naturally occurring, you know, very likely behavior. So you're pairing an unlikely behavior with a likely behavior. So the trainer would instruct their client to put their running shoes in a place where they would naturally find them. And then that way they'll be tempted to put them on to go for like a walk, right? So for instance, like if you put your running shoes, you know, on like on your bathroom sink, right? It's like when you wake up in the morning, you'll be like, oh, that's right, I gotta go. Like, you guys have probably done it. I used to leave, you know, you leave stuff on your key ring or you leave stuff by the front door. You know, I have a problem with like forgetting stuff all the time. And so like, I will leave like things that I want to remember to take with me basically in front of my front door. So I literally can't open the door unless I grab that thing, and now I've got it in my hand and I can take it with me. So that's pre-macking. You're going to pair something else with something else. So even just like little things like, you know, if you were to, this is like putting sticky notes on like your computer, right? Where you're going to see like these notes and say, that's right, that reminds me to do this thing. Put it somewhere where basically you're not going to forget about it. There's also stimulus control. Stimulus control is you're going to basically create conditions where it's either impossible or at least unfavorable for an undesired behavior to occur. So this is actually kind of similar to negative reinforcement. You're basically, or I'm sorry, this is really similar to response cost. You're basically going to remove this thing that you are trying to keep your client from doing and just not have it, you know, there for temptation. So removing ice cream from the house in the hopes that it will cause your client, like, you know, this is a real life example that I've used actually a couple of times where I've had clients who like maybe struggle with like sweets and things like that. And ice cream seems to be the big one that a lot of people just like to have in their house. And so I will often encourage my clients like don't bring ice cream home with you from the grocery store. If you want ice cream, it's totally okay. Like, there is room for life with ice cream, you know, but having it in your house leads to these untargeted behaviors. And a lot of times, like the people I'm working with, it's like that then leads to feelings of guilt, which leads to feelings of like damaged self-worth, which leads to feelings like negative emotions, which often leads to like negative behaviors, which leads to even more consequences. So it creates like a very negative feedback loop. So don't bring it in the house. Like, keep it out of the house. If you want ice cream, put your shoes on, get a jacket on, get in the car, drive to Cold Stone or Baskin Robbins or whatever, right? It's going to be more expensive. It's going to be more difficult to do, and it will give you time to go, do I really want this? Not more than like, staying home and cozy tonight, so that's an example of like stimulus control. This is actually, and by the way, like stimulus control has been used, for years without people even thinking about it. This is why there are massage therapy studios inside of gyms now. There's juice bars inside of gyms. Like these are all things where it's like they are, putting you in a scenario where you're going to be around them and therefore more likely to, pay for them or buy them, which can be a good thing, So there's a couple different versions of this out there. There's environmental stimulus control, which is like basically you're reducing the availability of a stimulus within that environment. So that is, like I said, like just remove it from the house. That's an example of like environmental stimulus control. You're just keeping it from being a temptation. But there's also like stimulus narrowing. And this is where basically you're trying to strengthen an association between like one specific place and like a behavior, right? So like we start to associate it with like a very specific setting. Again, like a juice bar being inside of the gym is a really good example of that. You start to draw an association with like, oh, I go to the gym to get a smoothie, right? And that can be a really good example of like drawing positive associations, right? If you started associating like going to the gym with, or like look at like running groups. I used to be part of this running group, and it would always like, you'd run with the crowd, and then like we would always run to basically a different brewery every time, and so you started associating like this healthy behavior with this reward of like, going to a brewery and having fun conversations and playing board games and doing different things, and obviously like beer and stuff as well. So that's an example of like you start to draw this like association, and it's kind of nice. Like it's like that leads to, I don't feel like doing these other versions of like maybe unhealthy habits in like a different setting, Now, another one that we've got is going to be modeling. Modeling is the process of basically demonstrating an action in order to help someone else learn how to duplicate that action. And this is where you as the fitness professional, you need to like display that you are exercising like regularly, that you're engaging in a healthy diet regularly, with your clients. And that way they can see those things and start to replicate them, right? So this is a great way to help somebody develop new skills, This is where we get the idea of like behavioral coaching or modeling, right? And so this is basically, coaching technique relies on like where you will carefully define what the behaviors are, right? This is, by the way, looking at like classic coaching, right? Let's say you're like a football coach. You're like, all right, here's exactly what I want to have happen, right? We're gonna execute this play like this, right? And so you draw the play up and then you practice it, right? And so you give a very elaborate, very detailed description, sometimes in written form, sometimes not. And then they're gonna go through that action. You as the coach are going to judge the execution, describe anything that they did incorrectly, model what they did, how to do it correctly, and then have them like repeat that with the correct actions. Dalen, do you have a question?
I know I had bumped my mute button by accident.
Oh, okay. But yeah, let's look at this. I mean, like, look at this is how it goes in like a session, right? So a lot of times, like, let's say you're trying to teach your client how to do like a bent over row, right? And so they're going like this and they're doing that row. And you're like, hey, that's great. Like, I like the angle of your arms, like you're pinching good in your upper back, but we've got a lot of spinal flexion happening. And so like, I'm literally showing them what I mean. So what you're doing looks a little bit more like this. What I want you to do is I want you to flatten your low back out and hinge with a nice flat low back, right? So it looks a little bit more like that. Now you try it. And so then they go in, we have them execute the play, right? And then we say, okay, so you're still rounding a little bit. So we describe what they're doing incorrectly. And again, we model it and say, flat low back, right? We model that for them. And then we imitate that correct execution, right? So we take them through it. And one other thing that I like to do in here as well is I also like to have my client feel the difference between what they were doing before and what they're doing. So then I will have them often, once they get the correct action, I'll have them go back to the old bad action, like feel that, and then I'll do the correct way. Feel that? Do you feel the difference? And they go, yeah, I feel it, right? So that's behavioral coaching using modeling. This is super key. You want to teach your clients good form and not worry about them having bad form or falling back into it. This is the kind of thing that you kind of need to go through with pretty much every exercise in there, make sure that you are continually watching your client, make adjustments as necessary. But like I said, define what you want them to do. You should always be giving your clients like a demo, right? Have them execute the play, judge whether or not they did it correctly, describe what they might have done incorrectly if they did, model how you want it to look, and then have them execute it properly, right? Don't let your client get all the way to the end of a set doing something improperly. If they get halfway through, stop them and make adjustments. So that's modeling, and that's a huge part of the coaching process. Now, outside of sort of the classic behavior therapy, just looking at some other things that are very much associated with behaviors. A lot of times, the people in our life are often what sort of draw us into untargeted behaviors. A lot of times it's our relationships, social pressures, and things like that are kind of drawing us away from targeted behaviors. And so sometimes clients will have a hard time talking to their friends or family or whatever about these targeted behaviors that they might be trying to avoid, right? And so sometimes your clients are going to need help with what we call assertiveness training, right? And this is basically putting a lot of emphasis on how to role play and develop assertiveness for themselves, right? So what assertiveness, it's any act that serves to maintain a person's rights, right? Like if somebody has someone in their life that says something maybe derogatory and you don't like hearing that, right? You either are going to stand up for yourself and say hey, don't say that, right? Or maybe you're too shy or socially awkward or nervous about doing that. So then that other person just keeps getting away with it. Assertiveness gives you that power back to yourself. So assertive behaviors are going to, enhance your sense of self. A client a lot of times will feel awkward about telling their friends that they are on a diet, for instance. They're I'm on this diet, and they're oh yeah, but you can fall off the diet for one day. This isn't that bad. We're ordering pizza. We're all going in on it. That sounds like a very small thing, but it's a big deal. It's something that's pulling your client away from their goals and making them feel what they want to achieve is less important than this other person. So a lot of times they need to have assertiveness to sort of enhance that. And then there's also aggressiveness, which is an act that achieves the person's desired goals by hurting or taking advantage of someone else. So a lot of times the more aggressive person in whatever will often be the one who gets their way, because again, it tends to be a little bit hurtful. So if our client is dealing with that, we definitely don't want to have them, deal with this aggressiveness that maybe other people will have. And aggressive doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be violence or anything like that. It can be, something very small as saying yeah, but we're all going in on it. And so, don't be a party pooper. Something small like that. It's not that hurtful, except that it is. It's pulling your client away from their goals and keeping them from succeeding, which leads to stress in their life. And so a lot of times they need to have assertiveness for themselves to say no, I'm not going to, engage in this, right? So how do you help your clients become more assertive? Or if you're trying to be more assertive, how do you do that? One of the best ways is to maintain eye contact. Getting comfortable doing that is very important. Body posture, not closing down and just presenting yourself as open and responsive. Gestures is huge, right? Your facial expression and vocal tone and volume are also important. It's important not to become overly aggressive. It's just important to stand your ground and speak clearly. Timing is really important as well. Obviously this should be brought up at the right time. teaching a client that like, don't let it get to a position where it's too late. Like, put this out there in front of, put this out in front so that you don't feel like you have to explain, over explain on the back end. And then make sure that the content is always like relevant, right? So making sure that like, we associate like this thing. It's like, no, look, this is important to me. I'm working towards this goal, this is something that I've dealt with, and you guys are going to deal with married couples. A lot of times like you'll be training your client and their spouse is not, working towards their goal, not that they want like their spouse to not succeed in their goal. It's just like, it's not as important to them on the surface of their brain, right? Like, it's like this person might have like a weight loss goal or a health goal or whatever, right? And like their spouse is like supportive to a certain level, but like at the end of the day, like people, we're very aware of our own self-interests. We are often very unaware of like the interests of others. And so a lot of times we will put our interests first. So you'll have like a married couple who, your client, their spouse is like, hey, can we eat out? Can we order in? Or like maybe they're not exactly helping with like, making healthy meals, or maybe they want something unhealthy, or they're buying stuff that's unhealthy, right? And so your client will get frustrated or flustered from like not being able to like communicate effectively. So helping your client like learn how to develop a little bit of assertiveness, in order to like kind of stick up for what it is they're trying to achieve, is something that you'll do. And a lot of times for me, it's just a very simple conversation. It's the same conversation every single time where I'm just like, what I would do is just explain to your spouse that like, hey, this is actually really important to me. And it doesn't seem like this thing is associated with it, but like this is keeping me from doing this thing that's important to me. So because this is important to me, I would appreciate, help, right? I'd appreciate support on this, right? And honestly, like that's enough. That is totally, this is like a spousal situation or a friend situation. Very rarely is it somebody outside, that this person doesn't have like an emotional connection with. So just simply explaining that like this is important is usually enough. Honestly, like that usually ends it instantly. So now we've talked a lot about behavior therapy. Do you guys have any questions on any of the different techniques we've talked about?
I'm good.
All right. So let's take a look at like what techniques, what interventions are going to be effective for depending on where our client is in the stages of change, right? So if you've got a client who's in the pre-contemplative stage, right? Like again, not intending to change within 6 months, right? Somehow you're working with them, right? The focus of your behavior therapy really isn't about, how to work out more effectively. Instead, it's really just like if we can get some targeted behaviors towards like educating them on the benefits of a healthy lifestyle, right? So we're going to look at things like pre-macking, for instance. So maybe we just, coat their house with healthy magazines, health related magazines, or, maybe like a website as their homepage that's like, a healthy website, like a health related, like men's health or women's health or something like that. Something that is going to pair like a likely behavior with an unlikely one so that they start thinking about the benefits of exercise. So that'd be an example of like pre-macking or stimulus control. Again, how do we get someone to move from pre-contemplation into contemplation? We teach them, right? Education is the most effective tool. Then people who are in the contemplative stage, it's like, all right, they've accepted that a healthy lifestyle is important, but they can't really see themselves engaging in it or doing it, right? So there's somebody who intends to change within the next 6 months. So how do we get them to move into the preparation stage? Well, we start to make it easier for them to see themselves engaging in this activity, right? Because they're like, look, I've accepted that it's healthy and I've accepted that I'll do it, but I'm going to do it in 6 months. And we want to move them faster than 6 months. We're like, no, let's get you prepared and going today, right? Well, how do we do that? It's like, well, we got to make it seem undaunting. We got to make it seem like they can actually do it, right? So maybe we set up like a contingency contract, right? We can create a contract with the client where it's like, all right, we have a behavioral goal in mind of, getting healthy, right? Let's say we start, I want you to get a pair of like workout shorts or pants or whatever, a pair of athletic shoes. I want you to know what this is similar to the example I gave last night. I want you to know what your route is going to be to the gym and how you're going to get to work afterwards. Are you going to shower at the gym? I want you to kind of map out and we have these tasks to do, right? That's like our contract. So we set up, and then we'll set them up with like a reward of something like they'll enjoy, or maybe it's like, I love this one, smoothie time, right? If a client enjoys getting smoothies, then require that they only get those smoothies while they are at the gym, right? And then that's like an example of pre-macking. They have a likely behavior of getting a smoothie, but now we're getting them to start going to the gym, right? Or maybe a massage, right? They like getting a massage. They'll only do it at the gym, right? Now, if your client's in the preparation stage, right, so they are really intending to change and make drastic lifestyle changes in the next 30 days, right? Again, we go back to the idea of contingency contracting, right? We set them up for what our first 3 sessions are going to be, right? And we talk about like what the rewards and things like that are. And we start talking a little bit about like specific nutritional and fitness goals that they might have. Or maybe it's like relaxation or, assertive training, right? Teach your client how to say no, if they are really worried that they're not going to be able to stick to this because like they have family and friends that are just going to be a constant temptation. Teach them how to like develop that assertiveness, teach them how to say like, all right, well, for the next 30 days, like, try to get into the gym as much as you can, but let's start talking about like, how to have a conversation of like, now I'm going to have this salad. Or it goes the other way too, by the way. I call this challenging the food police. If you've got a client who's been sticking to their diet and they're in the middle of like a cheat meal, man, they will often, cheat meals are such a positive, but can be such a negative thing. And the people in their life are like, didn't you say you're on a diet? And they think they're helping, but it's like really judgmental. It leads to really negative feelings. Learning how to like stand up and be like, oh yeah, no, I've actually been really good this week. So this is my cheat meal, and this is well within my like plan. So I planned to have this, sort of cheat meal right now, and like learn how to like stand up for that and like not let that emotionally like wreck, your client is very helpful. Now, if your client's in the action stage, we're trying to like, this is somebody who is, started to change. They've maintained their habits. They haven't been able to maintain it for a really long time. So how do we keep them in here until it becomes like concrete habit, right? Again, a contingency contract for any fitness and nutrition goals. Setting contracts are great. But also now we start, doing things that are more advanced, right? And we start adopting like health as a lifestyle outside of the gym. So banning the elevator and be like, hey, you got to get to work. No longer allowed to use the elevator. We're only going to take the stairs from now on, right? And that's going to encourage your client to, engage in activity outside of the gym. So now it's like, that's the new habit, and engaging in activity at the gym is the easy stuff. That's where action's really effective. Action always benefits from giving your clients like a notch up, and where it's like you're adopting it in your life rather than just as like a habit that you do in the gym for an hour. You're not just somebody who works out, you're a generally active person. And then if your client's in the maintenance stage, this is actually where, they've been doing it for 6 months. I always like to have my clients start inspiring others. So identify like a specific type of exercise that maybe they've been trying to avoid, and then like go stop avoiding that. That's an example of relaxation training, but also like updating their goals with new goals and new rewards, taking them to the next level and be like, all right, well now, we're able to do 10 push-ups. Let's get to 50. It's like 50, that's a huge jump. It's like, yeah, it is, that's a great way to keep your client in there. It's like if they, they're definitely not going to lose the 10 if they're working actively towards like a new 50, So that is behavior therapy. I love behavior therapy. I think it is the most applicable to pretty much every client that we've got. I really recommend, if you guys want to check out that podcast, I'll put a link in the email today for you guys. And then you guys can get 10 hours there of extra credit. So that's 2 days of absences for those of you who may have been absent in class. Also, if you ever want to read The Power of Habit, guys, I really recommend it. It is a terrific freaking book and a fun audiobook too. The audiobook reader was a good one. read it twice and listened to it. So I really, really, really recommend it. And that is about all I got for you guys today. I'm gonna let you get on out of here if you guys don't have any questions.
All good, Brad. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, again. See you tomorrow. Oh,
See you tomorrow.
homework 2 is out today, by the way. So knock that out as well, please.
Got it. Thank you, Brad.
All right, see you guys.